Okay, now on to the main event. This afternoon, we are very lucky to have with us Stephanie Easley and Christy Martin from the coordinating group on alien pest species. Stephanie Easley has been the CGAPS Legal Fellow for Invasive Species since 2019. Prior to joining CGAPS, she was an assistant counsel with the Office of the Legislative Counsel of the U.S. Senate. And before that, she served as the judicial law clerk and worked in private practice in Washington, D.C., the swamp. Before law school, Stephanie worked as the natural resources specialist for the Jean Lafitte National Historical Park and Preserve in South Louisiana, and as a biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Arlington, Virginia. She received her Bachelor of Science in Biology from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and the State University and received her law degree from Stanford Law School. If you don't know Christy Martin, she is the program manager for CGAPS, a partnership of government agencies and non-government organizations whose mission is to catalyze action to protect Hawaii from invasive species. She has a BA in liberal arts with a focus on marine ecosystems and a master's in public administration, both from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Christy has more than 20 years of experience working on invasive species issues in Hawaii and the Pacific Islands, and in 2022 was appointed to the Invasive Species Advisory Committee, which provides information and advice for consideration by the National Invasive Species Council. Today, Steph and Christy will be reviewing existing regulations and gaps pertaining to our island biosecurity, and they'll also talk about opportunities for public participation in the legislative and regulatory process. The title of their talk is The People versus Invasive Species, How Laws, Rules, and Engaged Citizens Can Protect Hawaii. And I will pass it off to Christy and Steph now. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat or the Q&A. Mahalo.
Yeah, mahalo. Thanks so much for that introduction, Chuck. Stephanie and I are super excited to participate. We really enjoy these webinars. And let me share screen and let's see how that goes. All right. Are you folks seeing it? Okay, good. Hey, that works. All right. We really enjoy the themes that you folks come up with every year. And this year is Invasive Species is Everyone's Kuleana. And so we wanted to provide a talk about the people versus invasive species and how engaged citizens can use some of the tools available to help protect Hawaii. And so a short overview of our presentation today. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the laws and authorities. We're not going to talk about everything because there are a lot. We're going to talk about a few of the gaps and how some invasive species can enter in through those gaps and become problems. We're going to use a couple of examples. We're going to tell you a little bit about invasive plants and the gap related to that, and some gaps related to invasive animals. We're going to talk just a bit about legal processes like rules and rulemaking and laws and legislative process. And ultimately, it's about how engaged citizens can really pick up that kuleana, that responsibility, and honestly, that honor in helping to protect Hawaii. And our photo that we have decorating our slide is, of course, the Hawaii Invasive Species Awareness Month awardees and legislators and our governor. These are people that took up that mantle of responsibility to do something about invasive species this past year. They were awarded in the HISAM award ceremony earlier this month. And so this could be you next year. And so a quick introduction. If you're joining this webinar, you're already concerned about invasive species and their impacts on food security, biodiversity, public health, our built infrastructure, recreation, quality of life, our cultural practices, all of that. This is really here to remind us, though, that our climate is changing. And with that changing climate, there are synergistic impacts with invasive species. And that makes invasive species, in a lot of ways, much worse than they used to be. Oh my gosh, I long for the old days when all we had to worry about was, just trying to kill some ants. We're going out and hunting down Myconia, but now we have to worry about how much worse it's going to get, how much more difficult it's going to be in a changing climate. And in order to meet our resilience goals for the state or the island or even our communities, it means that we have to address invasive species. And we need everybody to help us fill these gaps.
Okay, I get to talk about some of the laws and the authorities that help us address invasive species. As Christy just mentioned, invasive species impact all aspects of life, but historically, they have been regulated by departments of agriculture. And that's because when initially these issues first came up, regulating the movement of pests and diseases of plants, it wasn't with respect to biodiversity or threatened and invasive species. It was worries about wheat rust in crops in the 17 and 1800s. So some of these laws are very old, and they were always administered by departments of agriculture because that was the focus, protecting agriculture. And that's the way it is now. There's the USDA, the Federal Department of Agriculture, which has the majority of the invasive species authorities on the federal level. And then within the state, the Hawaii Department of Agriculture. Once something gets to the state of Hawaii or to any state, it's the state's responsibility to regulate the movement of the invasive species and the control and eradication of that invasive species within the state. In Hawaii, there are 3 main agencies that have these responsibilities. The Department of Health has a vector control branch, and its job is to deal with impacts and abate vectors and organisms capable of transmitting human disease or affecting public health. They address pests like flies, mosquitoes, rodents, cockroaches, venomous insects, things like that. And I'm going to skip the Department of Agriculture for now and go to the Department of Land and Natural Resources. DLNR has 2 main responsibilities with respect to invasive species. The first is with aquatic invasive species, with ballast water and biofouling. Ballast water is the water that a large vessel sucks up to remain balanced as it puts on cargo and takes off cargo. It stores it in the hull of the vessel, and then it discharges the water when it needs to remain balanced based on the cargo and the conditions. So it can be sucked up in one port very far away, like the continental United States or another continent, and then travels with the vessel and then is discharged, or used to be often at the port where it is discharging its cargo. And it's been long established that this is a very effective pathway to move aquatic invasive species because they just get sucked up with the water in one place, moved a great distance, and discharged. The other responsibility is with hull fouling, and that's the organisms that grow on the part of the vessel that's underwater. These organisms, again, come in one port, grow on the vessel moves a long distance to another port, and those organisms can break off or fall off and become established there. So that's one responsibility of DLNR. The other is injurious wildlife, and that's a species which is known to be harmful to agriculture, aquaculture, native wildlife or plants, or a health hazard or a nuisance. And there's a list that DLNR keeps of species that are designated as injurious wildlife, and it prohibits those listed species from being released into the wild, transported to an area of the state where that species is not found, or exported from the state. And then I saved the best for last. That's the Hawaii Department of Agriculture. They have the bulk of the responsibilities and are the lead agency with respect to invasive species in the state. They have a lot of laws, 3 main chapters of laws that regulate invasive species. I'm going to kind of outline them. I know I'm giving a lot of information on this one slide, but there is a lot to it. It's a complex system. It would be wonderful if there was one entity that could just say, this is invasive, you can't bring it in, you can't plant it, you can't grow it, but that's not at all the system we have. We have this complex system. The first chapter is chapter 141. It was initially adopted into law in Hawaii in 1903, so it's a very old statute. it gives the Department of Agriculture the authority to make rules related to the importation, transportation, and propagation of plants, and the movement of plants, the importation and movement of animals, soil, pests, and diseases of plants. It also requires HDOA to make a list of species that are designated as pests for control or eradication, and to develop and implement a plan to control or eradicate each of those species. There's a new, this last legislative session, House Bill 2619 added a new requirement to this. If that bill hasn't been signed by the governor, or hadn't been as of yesterday when I last checked, and it requires HDOA in conjunction with partners to identify best practices to treat all pests that are designated. So hopefully once that is, if the governor signs it and once it's carried out, HDOA will have resources for people to look at on how that they can best treat each of these listed pest species. Then I'm going to skip to chapter 152. That is the noxious weed statutes. Those statutes were originally from 1957, excuse me. And they are sort of for a different time, in my opinion. They are related to preventing noxious weeds, which is any plant that is or likely to become harmful to agriculture, horticulture, aquaculture, livestock, or forest or recreation or conservation areas of the state. So plants that need extra chemicals, extra effort to control, that can kind of grow and overtake everything. And so it was, the noxious weed statutes were sort of formed to help agriculture producers who had large areas in production be as productive as they could without having to worry about these plants come and interfere with their agricultural productiveness. It requires the Department of Agriculture to create a list of species which are designated as noxious weeds, and then areas that are free of that species. And then the last statutory authority chapter that the Department of Agriculture has is kind of the big one, in my opinion. It's chapter 150A, and it regulates the importation of animals, plants, and microorganisms, and authorizes HDOA to regulate their movement within the state. Requires HDOA to develop lists of prohibited and restricted animals, microorganisms, and plants. So stuff you just cannot bring in, or if you do bring it in, you have to have a permit to bring it in and a permit to possess it. So for animals, there are these lists, right? If your animal that you want to bring into Hawaii or possess in Hawaii isn't on one of those lists, you have to apply to HDOA to get a permit for it and then get it put on one of those lists. So that's a long process. So every animal that is brought into Hawaii is required to have a permit and to go through this process. Chapter 150A also makes it illegal to import or sell noxious weeds. And it authorizes HDOA to prohibit the movement of certain types of plants and animals within the state. It provides penalties if you bring something in or possess it or have it, violate that chapter without a permit. And then it also has, the chapter has one other part, it's called Part 6, and it's the Biosecurity Program of Hawaii. This is a relatively new statute. It was initially adopted in 2008, and it's an attempt, I think, for the legislature and the Department of Ag to move beyond lists. It requires a multidimensional system to prevent the entry and movement of pests and to effectively eradicate and control pest populations within the state. There's another new provision in it from that House bill I mentioned before, requires HDOA to coordinate with partner agencies and organizations to control and eradicate invasive species. So that is a very brief and complex overview of the structure within Hawaii, and I bet you'll have questions at the end.
Thank you. If I were to summarize, I would say the Hawaii Department of Agriculture has the vast majority of the authorities over invasive species. So it behooves us to figure out what those are and how to make it strong. I get to cover a few examples of GAPS. You know, as CGAPS, we were named because of that acronym that spelled out GAPS. So a few of them are things like, you know, Hawaii can't prohibit the introduction of noxious weed or plant pests from foreign countries into Hawaii. Department of Agriculture, our state Department of Agriculture regulates domestic importation. And of course, we want to try and keep out as many pests as possible, but we're only legally able to do it from domestic sources. It takes a lot of effort to also restrict it from foreign sources. And a lot of times it's not possible. Federalists may not consider specific concerns of Hawaii or Pacific Island jurisdictions. Our pests are not necessarily pests of the United States, so it's hard to get our priorities listed as federal priorities. Our state rules are just a bit out of date. They're based on very old rules. You know, Stephanie mentioned a 1903 statute. In reality, we keep tinkering with old rules and hope that they work for modern situations. And in some ways, it's made things very, very complex and onerous to understand. There is no prohibition on the sale of plants or merchandise that are infested with the pest. This was a hot topic this past year. And guess what? We get to continue talking about it because it is still an issue. There's no restriction on the movement of pest-infested items within an island. Department of Ag has authorities. We need to help them be able to better regulate that. It's difficult to control or eradicate pests on private property without owner's consent. I'll leave that one there for now. Federal and state inspectors, all of the responsible agencies basically can't inspect everything. They cannot do everything. It is not practical. There's also legal limitations on it as well. So how do we find the sweet spot? That's going to be the question for everybody. And then, of course, there's limited enforcement and minor penalties where we do have some good language, but yet a minor penalty or no penalty for infractions. There we go.
Okay, I'll talk about some of the gaps with respect to invasive plants. So slide points out hundreds of thousands of plants, and a small percentage of them would become invasive if they made it to Hawaii. Plants shipped from foreign countries are regulated by USDA APHIS, and most domestic shipments are regulated by HDOA. These little boxes. So the United States has a federal republic system of government. So if the federal government can say to the states, we are going to regulate this area, you cannot regulate it. And that is what has happened with noxious weeds and plant pests from foreign countries. The federal government, it's called preemption. They preempt any state from making rules related to the importation of noxious weeds or plant pests. That's under the Plant Protection Act that was adopted in 2000. There is a process to get state-specific species on that list that could be prohibited, but it is an onerous process, to be honest. You petition, it can take years. It's just not a viable vehicle for the day-to-day invasive plants in Hawaii. Once something gets to the state, like we were talking about before, it's regulated by the Department of Agriculture. They have a list of noxious weeds. Unfortunately, that list was last updated in 1992. So the list of species is 32 years old, and the list of areas that are free of that species is 32 years old. That, is obviously ready for an overhaul. The types of plants that are in the nursery trade and in cultivation has changed a lot. Our knowledge about what would be invasive in Hawaii has changed a lot. So unless something is on that list that was created in 1992, no matter how invasive it is, it can be imported and sold within Hawaii. And that's why it is this one is really, it's everyone's responsibility to make sure that the plants that you're purchasing are not invasive species. There's a program, the Plant Pono website, you can go to, and it gives a score to invasiveness for plants that you're considering. It offers options of non-invasive plants for landscaping that you can use. And it's a way that consumers can ensure that what they're purchasing is not invasive, because the nursery stores aren't doing anything wrong, you know, legally by selling an invasive plant. There's no restriction. And many of the things that are for sale are in fact invasive. Next slide, please. One of the example species that we can use is Albizia. Maybe many of you are familiar with it. It's this beautiful tree. It is large, it is fast growing. It's possibly the fastest growing tree in the world. It has brittle limbs that are prone to suddenly dropping off without warning, so it can cause damage to structure. It's the tree that's always falling all over the highways when there's storms. It's capable of altering entire native ecosystems, you know, decreasing bird habitat, space for native species. It has extraordinary growth and seeding capabilities. It creates dense stands. They have actually, the legislature has gone to the extent of saying that you can go onto someone else's property and deal with an albizia tree that is impacting your property. So there's like an exception to criminal trespass to address albizia trees because this tree creates so many problems. However, it is not designated as a noxious weed. It can be imported, sold, planted, you know, used however anyone would want to use it in Hawaii. There's a little graphic here on the bottom from the Big Island Invasive Species Committee. They have resources for people to help, information about how to deal with albizia because it is such an invasive species and such a problem. But again, it's not listed as a noxious weed. Next slide, please. This slide has pictures of Miconia. This is a listed noxious weed. It is one of the most invasive plants in the world. In climates, tropical climates like Hawaii, it can grow, take over, just become this monoculture that is useless to wildlife, shades out other species. It grows quickly and close together. Its shallow root system can really impact the water table, changing how water rolls down through and is available for use. And it produces millions of tiny, once it matures, which I think is at 7 years, it produces millions of tiny seeds each year. And those seeds remain viable in the soil for up to 18 years. And so if you have a tree like this mama tree over here on the bottom and all her babies around her, it will just, you know, once it starts producing seeds, you have to work on that control project for 18 years. And we have a picture of the Oahu Invasive Species Committee crew showing how large the leaves grow. So this is a listed noxious weed. You can't import it or sell it legally, but it is here. It is spreading, particularly on Hawaii Island, and it creates a big problem for control programs, a big expense, and a big impact to the ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you. So responsibility here is always check your plants to see if they might be invasive, because turns out it may be legal to buy, but perhaps not smart to buy. And it can also help guide what you might want to pull out of your yard. If you happen to have Miconia in your yard, you definitely want to try to help out and do the right thing and try to. Just a shout out, by the way, to Chuck Chimera, Dr. Chimera, PhD botanist, who is actually facilitating this webinar. He is the weed risk screener. And so when you look up those plants on Plant Pono, it is because Chuck has done the research work for you to assess whether or not it may be invasive in what. So shout out to Chuck. Pointers disappeared. All right, I get to share the animal example though. So there's also gaps on the animal side. It's not just all shared by plants. Unlike plants, though, federal laws do not preempt state laws related to their importation. There's very few federal laws that do that, other than plant pests. And when I say plant pests, I mean pests of agricultural crops. So we're going to talk about everything that isn't a pest of agricultural crops when we say animals here. So what federal laws regulate that? Well, there's really only one. Everything we say is a caveat, but primarily one law, and that is the Lacey Act. That's the Fish and Wildlife Service Department of Interior Act that basically lists a few wildlife species to regulate their import from foreign sources as well as their interstate trade. There's not a whole lot of species on it. Things like constrictor snakes, large dangerous pet trade snakes are a topic for Lacey Act. So because the federal laws don't preempt or stop state laws from being enacted, we have some really good state laws for preventing the introduction and movement of invasive animals, yet we still have gaps. Well, we have state rules at the Hawaii Department of Ag, H2A. We have DLNR's injurious wildlife law, which Stephanie mentioned earlier. And we also have some, honestly, they're humane animal treatment laws related to do not release. So we have a few state rules there. One of them, Department of Ag, is very strong. Public Kuleana, though, is really important here. Don't buy or keep illegal species. This should be a no-brainer, but honestly, it's hard to figure out what's an illegal species. And people that have them sometimes know that they're doing illegal things, but think that it's not going to go wrong. Don't let your pets loose. And definitely take advantage of the state amnesty program that's run by the Hawaii Department of Agriculture for illegal pets. They have a no-kill policy. You spent all this time, raising and caring for your illegal pet Fido the snake, and you don't want it killed. You want to turn it in. You want to do the right thing. They have a no-kill policy. They will ship it off. They will find a facility for it, and you can rest assured it will be killed outside of the state. They'll ship it out. So examples of gaps, we love Googling. And so Stephanie and I Googled up a couple of examples. I went to Etsy because I do. And I found a site that sells all of these amazing but illegal animal aquarium invertebrate species. And there is no listing that it is illegal to actually import these into Hawaii. Stephanie went and found a website that was totally willing to sell her something, and she was all set to order it, except they wanted her credit card as well. They had her address, and so there was no warning that it was going to be illegal to import it into Hawaii. So it is very easy to get things here. Not that we're telling you to do it, but don't do it. It is too easy to do. I want to encourage you, if you know someone who has these things, please encourage them to turn it in to the amnesty. Next example is, honestly, it's just this sad tale, and I wanted to include it because it's such a good example of, how you can have the strongest regulation. Department of Agriculture, it's actually a restricted animal. Jackson's chameleon are restricted. It requires a permit for importation and possession. However, Jackson's chameleon made it into Hawaii, and people started moving it around because they were able to export it and make money in the pet trade in the U.S. mainland and elsewhere. And so they had an enormous spread across the state, people doing this. And the only thing that the Department of Land and Natural Resources could do was list it as an injurious species, which made it illegal to release these into the wild, as well as you need a permit if you're going to export it out of the state. There's other requirements for injurious species as well. But our take-home point for this, just because it's for sale doesn't mean that it is lawful to purchase the species. And of course, that it's not invasive. Even if it is lawful, it can certainly be invasive if it's released into the environment. And a reminder that it was shocking to me to realize that every animal brought into Hawaii actually requires a permit. So if you are importing animals into Hawaii, absolutely, there are some legal things that you have to do, and it is required through the Department of Agriculture.
Okay, I get to talk about administrative rules, which I love. When I was talking about the list of noxious weeds and the list of species, those are in the administrative rules. And just to give background, sorry if you already know this, there's the statutes, and that's what's enacted by the legislature. And then each agency is charged with carrying out the statute. And the way they do it is they make administrative rules. So that's the next layer. And administrative rules are made through a process which allows for public input and comment. When the Hawaii Department of Agriculture is considering any change to a species on one of those lists or to any component of its administrative rules, it will be considered by the Board of Agriculture and it will go to a public meeting. One way you can keep up with this is you can get on the mailing list for the Board of Agriculture meetings. And here on the slide, there is the email address. You request to be put on the mailing list. And then the meetings are held generally every month. And you can see the agenda and see if there's any items related to invasive species that you would like to offer written or oral testimony about, or just learn more about, because there'll be a submittal to the board. And if it's a change in the rules, that would also require a public hearing. And so you can attend the public hearing, give written or oral testimony on the change in the rules that will be considered by the Hawaii Department of Agriculture. So it's a slow process, and it's intended to be that way with many steps so that the public does have the opportunity. And a lot of times, you know, an industry that's impacted might be on it and might be there, but just general members of the public, of course, have jobs, have competing needs on their time. So you know, if you have the ability to keep up with these, your voice would probably be, you know, very well heard, because there's just not that many people who provide comments generally. There's also a specific process to petition the Board of Agriculture for a change to the rules. It's set out, you file a petition, you have to put certain information on it, like your name and what you're seeking to change, your interest in why you're seeking to change it. You submit it to the Board of Agriculture. Sorry, I live near a fire station. Hope you can still hear me. And once your petition is submitted, within 30 days, they either have to deny your petition or initiate rulemaking on it. And so that would be that process I just described: go before the board, go to public meetings. So if there's something you or a group that you work with is particularly interested in, you can file a petition and have the Department of Agriculture consider it. If it goes through the full process, it gets signed by the governor and it would become a rule of the agency.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. And then, so if you are interested in Board of Agriculture meetings, you want to check them out, you want to check out the agendas, go ahead and sign up. We've got an email address where you can sign up. You can also take a look at it. They post them on the Department of Agriculture website. All right. Every time I unmute myself, I lose my little. Okay. All right, this looks significantly similar to the previous slide, so bear with us. We talked about statutes as being the overarching authorities set by the legislature. That is a public process. And the public, you folks, can also participate in that. You can engage your legislator. You've got an idea, you can engage your legislator and request a bill to adjust an agency's authority to make sure that that they have the authority to do something. It gets, hopefully, if the bill gets scheduled for hearings, it goes to hearings. And of course, those are all public meetings where you can testify either in writing or in person, via Zoom. You can call into the meeting and have your voice heard I have seen legislators pay more attention to public testimony than actual agency representatives. And so the public has a very strong voice here. And also, everybody, regardless of your age, can participate in providing testimony. Everybody has a voice here. And honestly, I've seen legislators moved by kids. Usually, if there's two bills that are significantly similar, it will go for final review via conference. And so those differences will be worked out. Hopefully, if that succeeds, then it can move on to the governor, it gets signed into law. So there is a process for public participation. And if you're interested in learning more who your legislator is or resources about how to testify or submit letters or whatever it is, all of that's on the legislative website, capitol.hawaii. And so we just wanted to thank you for attending this or watching it after the fact on YouTube. Just appreciate your time and your interest. We are available for questions via email. You can go to our website as well. And I do note that we have a couple of questions in the Q&A and the chat, but I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Christy. As always, excellent presentation. As a glass half full kind of person, I'm always focused on the gaps and the negatives and all. Oh boy, we need to fix this. We need to fix that. But it's nice to end it with positive, proactive things people can do to hopefully plug and fix some of these gaps that you've pointed out. So we do have a few questions already, and I think you can see them, but I'll start with the one in the Q&A first. Should we report websites or shops selling species that are illegal, and what is the best way to report? 643pest.org? Question mark.
You know, I'm going to also mention that Emily in the chat has a significantly similar one, so maybe we can answer those together. Is there a way to engage directly with the seller to alert them of the legality of selling to Hawaii? I'm going to take it backwards, actually. Emily, yes, you can. In fact, one of our awardees for HiSam this year was able to do that, just took it upon themselves to reach out to sellers, online sellers of plants that were invasive, and just took on that kuleana herself, really took it to heart. And so, yes, absolutely. If you want to check firsthand to see if something is invasive or what our thoughts are on it, feel free to go and reach out to any of the resources. You can reach out to myself, Stephanie. You can reach out to the agencies. Hawaii Department of Agriculture would be one. You can reach out via 643pest.org, and Beth will route it accordingly. So we are all here to help you be successful as a public person protecting Hawaii. I don't know, what are your thoughts on the best way to report illegal species? So what is the top choice? Chuck, do you have a thought on that, or Stephanie?
I know Beth Spieth is on. She's the 643 pest coordinator, and I don't know if it's the best way, but it's certainly one way. We get occasionally reports of invasive animal sales, usually that get sent into 643 pest, and I think the process has generally been to share that information with the Hawaii Department of Agriculture and then acknowledge to the person sending in the report that it's been received. So that's probably the simplest way, because all you have to do is remember 643 pest, and you don't have to think like, oh, should I send this to HDOA? Should I contact DLNR? That's what 643 pest is there for. So that's definitely that will guarantee that it should get to the appropriate agency.
And especially if it is an illegal species that you're reporting or making some sort of tip on, you definitely want to go either directly to Hawaii Department of Agriculture, because it is a regulatory issue, or 643pest.org, who keeps a chain of communication record that is appropriate for this. So thanks. Let's see, what else we got?
You see the other
Oh,
ones in the
Bill.
Q&A?
How's it, Bill? Yes, I love your question. Who regulates non-life forms like viruses and prions? You know, for viruses, that would be, for example, that would be the Hawaii Department of Agriculture. If you are importing anything, that would require a Department of Agriculture permit, even if you're doing super specialized research into health effects of a virus. You need a Department of Agriculture. You need to go through that animal process with the Department of Agriculture, microorganism process. Steph?
Yeah, they have a chapter of microorganisms. They have non-restricted microorganisms list, restricted microorganisms list of organisms that are impact human health that don't require a permit but require notification to Department of Health. And they do have a whole procedure there and a permit application form that you would need to use.
And then the next question, Bill, you've got my favorite topic these days. We are dealing with a few issues right now regarding invasive species on federal lands. And I knew this instinctively, but I never really internalized it, in that, you know, federal lands are owned and managed by those federal agencies. That's why when you go to the national park, you've got national park police and law enforcement. Their own agencies can enforce their own laws there. They can set their own speed limits and things like that. And so our hope and our desire related to invasive species is that the federal agencies that manage their federal lands mirror the state laws related to invasive species. And I will stop there because Stephanie is always great at teaching me a little bit more.
It's another morass. The way, like, every parcel of federal land what has or military land and parkland has in its deed or enabling legislation how the jurisdiction is going to be with respect to the state. If it's going to have concurrent jurisdiction or exclusive jurisdiction, and how the state can operate on those lands. And so the state laws do apply, but if they have exclusive jurisdiction, the state has no authority to enforce them. And even if they do have authority, there has to be cooperative arrangements worked out for the enforcement. So it's always what Christy's talking about, you know, engaging the federal landowners, particularly, I guess, in Hawaii, the military, to work on how to best make sure that their programs focus on invasive species, let new recruits coming know about the invasive species laws, that something that they might have had on the mainland cannot be brought to Hawaii. And if they do have it in Hawaii, and they find out they can't have it, don't just dump it in the ocean, don't just let it go. There are laws that regulate that as well. So that's a kind of an ongoing project.
Yep. Good question. Any other questions?
Well, if nobody has, oh wait, here's the one. Why the place where
I'm with you, Bill. Oh my gosh, I've been working in, you know, I keep saying in my bio that I've worked in invasive species for over 20 years. Dude, I'm still learning things. It is confusing. I totally agree.
We'll leave a few more moments for questions. If nobody has one, I had one for you, and you don't have to answer it, but this is just a hypothetical. If you found a magic lamp and a genie could grant you one wish, is there one piece of legislation or law or act above all others that you would like to see passed that could improve our biosecurity situation? And if the answer is pass, you can just say pass.
I have to think of, oops, more emergency equipment. So sorry. For me, that I would love it if I could do anything, if we changed the plant list from a list of what's noxious and can't be imported to a list of what you can import, the same way that we have for animals. Because, you know, there's just so many things in the nursery trade. There's so many things we don't know. To have a white list of species that could be brought in that would not be invasive, that would be good for Hawaii, I think would be a dream. But that's my, if I was a, you know, governor for a day genie dream.
Well, and I've got a slightly separate answer, because if you're going to remove the walls in my brain, I'm gonna tell you what I think. I wish it would be Hawaii would approach it more like New Zealand, where the people ended up saying that the environment is our livelihoods, and they put in an overarching biosecurity legislation as the primary guiding principle of their land. And so their laws are set up with biosecurity as one of the first and foremost considerations. So yeah, that'd have to be some pretty powerful lamp, but that's what I would wish for.
Excellent answers. I couldn't agree more. So I think we still have time, but I don't see any more questions. I will give the participants one final opportunity to list their favorite website where they buy invasive species online, or submit one final question. If not, I think while we're wrapping up, I think we have one more poll we like to run at the end of the webinar, just to the post engagement one. So I guess we'll launch that now. And while we're waiting for the participants to fill out those questions, I just again wanted to thank Stephanie and Christy for once again providing such an engaging, informative presentation. I'm definitely going to bookmark it in my web browser, because I always go back and refer to your talks regarding legislation and the whole regulatory process to remind myself why we can't do something that I wish we could do. And hopefully move forward and find some solutions for that. So I think that's it. I'm going to end the poll now. And yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone again for attending today's webinar. And if you want to see this one again or any other one, you can check that out on the HiSam webpage. We still have one more coming up this afternoon, and then a final one tomorrow at noon. So mahalo again for participating today, for your great questions. And once again, thanks to Stephanie and Christy for taking time to share their mana'o. Aloha.
Aloha, thanks for coming.
Okay.